welcome to Intergenerational Politics with Jill Wine-Banks and Victor Shi, where we host weekly political discussions that are engaging and relevant to all generations. This is Victor Shi. I'll be an incoming freshman at UCLA next year, and I'm also the proud co-host of this podcast with Jill. Jill, do you want to give us a brief introduction about who you are for our audience listening today?
Sure. My career started during Watergate when I was the only woman on the trial team for the Watergate trial. I went on to become the general counsel of the U.S. Army, and I am now an MSNBC contributor and the author of The Watergate Girl, about my experiences during Watergate. The subtitle is my Bringing About Justice Against a Criminal President, which has become relevant again. And today we are very thrilled to have as a very special guest, Bill Kristol. He has been a leading participant in American politics and the debates surrounding everything for many years now. He's a widely respected analyst of politics and has been the founder of the Weekly Standard. He served in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations before founding the Weekly Standard in 1995, and was an influential intellectual on conservatism for over 2 decades. Now he is the founding director of Defending Democracy Together, which is a 501c4 advocacy organization composed of conservatives and Republicans fighting for consistent conservative principles like the rule of law, free trade, and expanding legal immigration. He is in the midst of the national debate on issues ranging from American foreign policy to the future of the Republican Party and the meaning of American conservatism. He is the perfect guest to talk about what being a conservative means in our current political climate, why Defending America Together opposes President Trump, what he sees as the authoritarian and nativist inclinations and impulses of the Trump administration, and what it means to hold conservative values, and what it means to be an American. So thank you very much for being here, Bill. I think this will be a very interesting discussion, and I'd like Victor to ask the first question.
Thanks,
Yes.
Joe.
Yeah. So, you worked in the Reagan and Bush administrations, governments that you believe reflected what a Republican administration should be like in terms of the true meaning of conservatism. For my generation and for myself, Trump may be the only reference point of the Republican Party that we have. So it's fair to assume that our view of conservatism and the Republican ideology is a bit inaccurate. So can you tell my peers and I how we should believe conservatism and explain what it means for our audience, especially those like me who grew up knowing only Trump as a representative of the Republican Party?
I mean, I wish I could confidently tell you that it's inaccurate, but for you it is accurate, and maybe it's unfortunately going to be accurate for a while longer. I mean, that the total collapse of the Republican Party before Trump has been one of the really startling stories of the last 3-4 years. Trump's election was a surprise. His presidency has been as bad as I expected, but it would be a lot better if you had a party that stood up to him, not even all the time, but some of the time, or some of the party. And that's in fact happened in history before. It's not as if we have had presidents who've gone off the rails, who tried to do things they shouldn't have done, foolish policies, or as Jill said earlier in a way, implied sort of criminal or quasi-criminal actions, impeachable actions. But some Republicans did oppose Nixon. Some Democrats opposed Johnson's war in Vietnam. One of the really amazing things has been things for me has been the collapse of the party, the elected officials, and of the conservative sort of elites, the conservative intelligentsia, conservative business types, donors, and so forth. So that's bad, and I don't want to sugarcoat it. I can look back at a healthier conservatism and a healthier Republican Party, but I do think for people your age, it's a real question, and for all of us, therefore, it's a real question going forward, whether we ever get that party back.
Yeah, I mean, so when you were in the Bush-Reagan administrations, what were just like the basic character and like values of those presidents? And then like kind of contrast that with the views and actions of Trump for this generation who may not remember what it was like to grow up in a time with a traditional, sane Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, Reagan and Bush were actually very different, of course, fought each other in 1980 and represented sort of different wings of the party, but I think each in its own way was pretty impressive. I mean, Bush was a war hero, an establishment with genuine patrician background. His father was a distinguished senator, but a real patriot, sort of established, the best of the American establishment is the way we put it, and had some limitations and made some mistakes. But that's an important part of American history. And, most at the end of the day, countries have establishments, and it's good to have a reasonably healthy and civic-minded and patriotic one. And Bush was therefore willing to compromise, and he compromised with the Democratic Congress on a Clean Air Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act and a budget deal. Also willing to be tough, and was with Saddam Hussein and so forth. Reagan came out of the ideological wing of the Republican Party. Some people preferred that, some people preferred the Bush wing, but Reagan was a man of principle. He had his views. Not all of them were, I didn't agree entirely with all of them, but I agreed with the basics of them, especially after the 70s, that getting back to sort of an energetic free market economy, and above all, standing up to the Soviet threat abroad, were key to our success. But whatever their differences, both of them, they made mistakes, but both of them were awfully different in character. I mean, they were genuine patriots. They genuinely looked at, of course they were politicians, but they didn't sacrifice the public good for trivial personal gain or for trivial partisan gain, really. And at times did things that really were cut against their partisan interests. I mean, Reagan had a lot of advice in 1981, 82 to loosen up, to pressure Volcker to loosen up on the crackdown on inflation and to stimulate the economy and not to go ahead with the tax cuts and so forth. Bush had a lot of pressure to do other things when he was president, and both of them, on the big things, tried to do what was right for the country.
Yeah, all of that is lost now. And you kind of mentioned just serving on behalf of the public. Trump is not serving on behalf of the public. It seems just his own interests and his own political pursuits.
Yeah, very much. I mean, for people your age, McCain is a more recent example, I would say,
Right.
of a truly patriotic American. Mitt Romney, again, maybe not the perfect candidate, but again, someone who just sincerely, his father also, he very much an establishment figure, his father, governor of Michigan, but someone who really tried to do the right thing for the country, and never would have thought of behaving, honestly, neither McCain nor Romney, behaving in the way that Trump routinely behaves. And so the degradation of our culture, the demagoguery, the nativism, the willingness to pander to the worst instincts of people, that's something we've seen it among many politicians, obviously, and some in both parties. There's always been that strain in the Republican Party, but it's never ascended to the presidency. And one of the really incalculable aspects, I think, of the Trump years is how much damage has having had a president who panders to those aspects of America and of the American people, the American psyche. How much damage does that end up doing? It's one thing to have a Joe McCarthy as a senator. It's one thing to have George Wallace as a governor and, a presidential candidate who won 5 states. They both did quite a lot of damage, but nothing like having a president who does this consistently for 4 years. So that's what worries me, really one of the things that worries me the most going forward.
I would have to say today's a bad day to have mentioned Mitt Romney, who had some hopes for, but I share your view and your worry in a way that I never thought would be possible. And I actually, of course, am old enough to remember when there was civil and intellectual discussions and debates between conservatives and liberals. They focused on the issues. They agreed on the facts. They didn't make up facts to have a fake argument. They actually agreed on the facts and debated what policies would reach a solution to any problems. I can remember the William Buckley's firing line program and then the Buckley-Gore debates. I long for a time when we could go back to having an agreed set of facts and to go back to that. Now we're in the days, following Ruth Bader Ginsburg's untimely death, and Republicans who said in 2016 that Obama can't have even a vote, no consideration, no hearing, no interviews of a candidate for a nominee for the Supreme Court, but they're rushing ahead to make sure that they nominate and confirm Donald Trump's third choice for the Supreme Court, so that we would now have a 6-3 conservative majority on the court. And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, having been in a day when there was compromise and discussion, and when things got done, there wasn't gridlock, and when dialogue across party lines meant something, but didn't mean that you couldn't reach a conclusion, much as Scalia and Ginsburg did, where they were friends, even though they were at opposite ends of the spectrum. Nowadays, we're so divided. Is there some advice that you would have for me and for Victor's generation about how to have that conversation with Republicans, particularly those who are still, supporting Trump? And particularly, I want Victor's generation to know that it's possible to have a conversation. So what would you advise?
I mean, honestly, it's hard with Trump being there because he's such a polarizing figure, and he invites it and welcomes it, that he polarizes his own supporters and they become almost unrecognizable. Someone like me, who knew a lot of these people and worked with a lot of them really quite closely in some cases over the years. I think if you want to see that older tradition, among the conservative intellectual types, there it remains. We had a piece in the Bulwark by Adam White, a constitutional scholar, urging an effective compromise. The Republicans should not push this through in a really semi-illegitimate way in the last weeks of a Congress, after blocking Garland, who was nominated in February or March, I think, for the Scalia seat. But in return, perhaps Biden or the Democratic leadership could say they're not going to expand the court. We'll just have a deal to kind of have this go in an orderly way that doesn't damage our institutions. And in fact, David French, my friend who writes for The Dispatch and who's quite conservative on many issues, seconded this idea in Time magazine just yesterday or today. So it's not as if, I think one can imagine I could get together 10 people and we could have a nice discussion and work out a lot of these things and agree to disagree on some things, and probably find actually areas of common ground on quite a few things. I do think, now, whether that's doable in a highly polarized partisan atmosphere with all the incentives for that are built in, I think it's an open question. I do think Trump makes it infinitely worse and harder. So that's why I've been so focused on just defeating Trump, to be honest. It sounds sort of simple-minded. Of course, he's a symptom. He's not just the cause and so forth. But I think of it as an infection or something. If you're ill, if you have a problem, and you go to the hospital, you need to deal with the infection first. Then you can deal with whatever the problem is in your, in your knee or in your, and other serious problems, obviously, and whatever. But you got to get rid of the infection. And Trump, just having a president who just endlessly looks to polarize, never looks for a chance to bring the country together. Even in the midst of a pandemic, as late as March of this year, I believe we didn't have high hopes for Trump. I tried to find someone to primary him. I was against him. I was working already, trying to organize Republican voters against Trump and Republicans for Biden. But even then, I thought, well, maybe in this pandemic, he'll at least say, this is a genuine national crisis. There's no right wing or left wing way to deal with a public health threat, really. There's science, and then there are policies, and there might be differences on weighting some of the policies, but it's not really an ideological thing, right? And the idea that he's managed to have the country divided on that, so that a third of the country thinks, it's a good thing not to wear masks. That really is, that's a level of damage. And unfortunately, you got to say, parts of the public seem receptive to that too, which is, there's a level of irresponsibility there that's a little bit worrisome for the future. So
definitely. And I think we were at an election that was focused on the 200,000 deaths that have occurred and the fact that we don't really have a national response to COVID. But do you think that this Supreme Court vacancy has shifted the terms of the election and changed it to one where it could end up motivating Republicans who want this seat to be filled by a conservative justice? Or could it motivate the Democrats to suddenly realize what is at stake if this goes forward? And I want to add to that question a sort of second thought, because you mentioned how we used to have bipartisan agreements and discussions and could reach compromise. And you suggested one, which would be, we won't enlarge the court if you agree to wait until after the election. Is that even remotely possible that that would happen? Or is McConnell and Trump so interested in power and a conservative court that no matter what, they're going ahead with it, even if it hurts some endangered Republicans running for re-election?
I mean, when people made this proposal, and Adam made it in the Bulwark, which I'm editor at large at, so I had a little bit to do with it. I mean, we kind of thought, well, McConnell personally may not like it and Trump may not, but there might be 4 or 6 or 8 Republican senators who would like that idea, take the pressure off, let them not energize their opponents by having to cast a vote and, at the end of October in a very controversial flipping a court seat and maybe the court on some issues. And that therefore there might, and the Democrats would be, I think, if they had no particular interest in expanding the court, as long as you didn't have this kind of thing going on, they could just make the appointment in normal after January 21st and fill the seat. And we'd go on with some form of business as usual. But I've been amazed at how, no Republicans have really stepped up on this, including Mitt Romney, whom you alluded to earlier, and I mentioned, who I'm pretty confident read those pieces, but didn't choose to go that way. Mm-hmm. So I guess the short answer on that is pretty gloomy. Now, things could change. We could be 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, the fights goes on. Republican senators realize the country's not with them on this. Maybe they don't like the nominee so much, or she doesn't do so well in some hearing or something, and suddenly you could imagine, I could still imagine this happening, in other words, as a default. Mm-hmm. But I mean, in terms of the politics of it, I think it's hard to say, but the polling shows right now that people think it's a little bit illegitimate or questionable to be doing this. Most people aren't focused on court seats the way we are. So for most people, I think the economy and COVID and the big issues still tend to outweigh that. What a little bit of a theoretical, you'd have to explain to people, well, if this seat flips, then the following might happen. And that's a little hard to, that's perspective. On the other hand, with the Affordable Care Act up for a hearing, November 10th, I think, there are real possibilities of decisions being made that people might not like and would affect their lives, obviously. So I think it'll become, parts of each base will be energized. But I'd say for the swing voters, and we've dealt with quite a lot of them in some of the efforts we've made in Republican voters against Trump, I think more chance of people turning against Trump and against the Republican senators on this, less because of the details of the issues, though a little bit of that, and more of a sense of, we just can't, you hear this from a lot of swing voters, we can't go on like this. It's too divisive. It's too partisan. It's too crazy, frankly. It's not healthy for the country. People don't like it when they can't speak to their other family members because they're now divided over Trump. And we're going to have 6 weeks where no one can speak to anyone, right? I mean, it's going to be really worse. And so I think and Trump's the incumbent, he can demagogue all he wants, but he created this circumstance. He could have avoided this by just saying, over the weekend, after Justice Ginsburg passed away, that he was going to withhold his ability to nominate, or he would nominate but understand that there might be a hearing or two, or the FBI could do its investigation and so forth. But he understood this would not happen until the next. He hopes he could say, I hope to be reelected, and then we will move quickly on this nominee. But I'm not going to urge Senator McConnell to jam it through. He, of course, didn't choose at all the statesmanlike way. But I think as a result, there is could be something of a backlash. I also think if you think about I wrote this up on the Bulwark. I mean, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is kind of a folk hero, you might say, to an awful lot of Americans. And I'm struck talking to people, I don't know what you found, Jill or Victor, on this. I mean, not just to liberals. I mean, there are a lot of moderately conservative people, more women, I would say, for whom she was such an important figure in terms of being a trailblazer and an admirable, impressive overcoming of all those obstacles, an admirable person. And there's a lot of respect for her in the sense that, doesn't mean you have to appoint a justice who exactly would agree with her, but somehow just being so contemptuous of what her wishes were might rub people the wrong way. And you combine that with a sense that people do respect the Supreme Court. I think they think actually correctly. I would say that Chief Justice Roberts has kind of helped the court avoid some of these most polarizing positions in the last year or two, and that's been good for the country. And that, the court's one of our institutions that works better than most. And now it's being just pulled into this mess. And then on the most famous issue, I guess, Roe v. Wade, whatever the merits of the decision, the polling consistently shows people don't really want to overturn it at this point. They might want to cut back on certain aspects and stuff. So all of those things make me think that the calculation politically is very tough for Republicans. But McConnell may have just decided, you know what, Trump's probably going to lose. We may lose the Senate. We Republicans may lose the Senate. This is my legacy. I want another conservative justice on the court, and I'm just going to jam it through no matter what. Whether that justice will end up doing what McConnell expects is another question, of course. As Roberts and Gorsuch to some degree have shown, these justices aren't quite as predictable as politicians sometimes want.
Well, the history on the Supreme Court is that oftentimes judges turn into justices who go completely the opposite of what the appointing president was expecting, because they recognize the higher duty to the Constitution. You've noted that the bulk of Americans, the overwhelming number, support Roe and would not want it abolished. The overwhelming number of Americans support the ACA, which, if this is rushed through, the appointment, the new justice could be the decisive vote in abolishing pre-existing conditions and the entire ACA.
But you know what would happen in that case? It's interesting, Jill, is that, pardon me for interrupting, is
Yeah.
So in that case, I mean, of course, if there's a President Biden and a Democratic Congress, they'll just pass a new ACA. The reason it would get struck down has to do with the mandate being allegedly unconstitutional and, unseverable from the rest of the act. They could pass the rest of the act without the mandate, honestly, and it may not be as healthcare policy quite as good, but they can still prohibit. No one doubts the federal government could prohibit discrimination for pre-existing conditions. They already did in certain respects before the ACA. And so I think people in some ways also, the conservatives who are all excited about this aren't really thinking it through. I mean, they're not, I say this to my conservative friends who are so excited about it. The court's become this kind of thing for conservatives, and this gets back to the earlier question, in the absence, I'd say, of a very concrete agenda for helping Americans or for dealing with America's place in the world and so forth. It's become this sort of golden, I don't know what, mystical object. Well, everything's worth sacrificing for the court. What exactly, if you're an actual conservative on social issues, on foreign policy, even on economic policy, what are you going to get from the court? They can do a lot of things that will annoy liberals and that maybe help some individual groups of conservatives be overturn some regulations and all, but they're not going to fundamentally change the welfare state. They're not going to fundamentally, they're not going to reverse same-sex marriage. I don't actually think they'll reverse Roe. And if they did, New York and California would promptly pass legislation guaranteeing abortion rights, at least in the big states. So, I mean, it's all a little bit out of kilter. I'm not saying the court's not important. It's very important. And the lower court judges, and I mean, Jill knows this, you know this better than I, there's a lot of issues they touch and they deal with. But the investment in it has become sort of a, the way people believe in certain, things that they get such exaggerated import. And I think they're going to pay a huge price, though, for this kind of obsession with the court.
Yeah. Oh my God. Well, I think that kind of brings us into our next question. You mentioned, what type of judges Republicans ought to be thinking about and what values do they hope to get out of this court. So for you, what type of justice would you like to see appointed? Are there any specific names? We have a few kind of in the bag with Amy Coney Barrett and another one from Florida. But for you personally, for Republicans that you've been talking to, what are you seeing on the ground? Are they thinking that Amy Coney Barrett kind of represents what you guys are hoping for, or is it someone different that you have in mind?
And one of the stupidest things about the current moment, I suppose this has always been true, though, people read 2 articles about some judge somewhere who's been a judge for 1 year or 3 years. And before that was, in her case, a law professor, in other people's case, lawyers or prosecutors or lower court state judges or whatever. And they think they can judge, they think they're capable of making a judgment about how qualified that person is. It's so ridiculous. Would you do that in any other sphere? You'd read some profile of a doctor and then say, well, that must be the best oncologist in the world. I mean, wouldn't you want to know more? Wouldn't you want to read peer reviews? Wouldn't you want to consult some people who've studied these people's writings and know them personally, perhaps? But of course, these days, everyone just takes, becomes sort of a litmus test thing, or, well, she has an attractive personal story, and, she's religious, and if you're that person, I'm for religion, I want religion to influence my judges a little more, or I share some views perhaps with her. But I don't feel, honestly, I don't know any of them. Personally, I would say, and this was in 2005, which wasn't that long ago. It seems like long ago to you. Of course, you would have been 3 years old, but I mean, if you're Dylan, it's recent times. I and David Frum and a lot of reasonably prominent conservatives opposed Bush's nomination of Harriet Miers, who was his White House counsel, who was a perfectly decent person, so far as I know. But we just thought, geez, this is not the quality of judge you should have for the Supreme Court. She had no judicial experience. She was a lawyer in Houston, I think, but not with great distinction or anything like that. She had been Bush's counsel. She knew him. Hadn't really gotten rave reviews for that either, honestly. And so we thought this is just, we had no ideological issue with her. I didn't really know her views on anything. There were plenty of conservative judges at the appellate level and state court level, we thought, who would be much better, judges. And so there used to be a little more of that too. I mean, whatever, again, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was one of the major legal minds of her generation, was put on the circuit court first and then moved up. Breyer, one of the major law professors in circuit court, and moved up. Kagan, dean of Harvard Law School. I mean, they were all, substantial, and the same, I'd say, on the Republican side with Roberts and Alito and stuff. So, I mean, I think the higher quality judges do have a little bit more willingness sometimes to listen to their colleagues and compromise. Not always. They can be pretty tough, Scalia and actually RBG in her own way. But still, I think there's more of a sense that at times we need to put some things aside and, agree for the sake of the institution and for the sake of a certain kind of comedy. And but that's and I'm not saying these individual judges who are being mentioned now wouldn't be that way either. I just think we don't know much about them. I mean, for me, at least Amy Coney Barrett, she's a law professor. She's written some things. She was much discussed when she was nominated for the appeals court 3 years ago. This judge from Florida, honestly, I followed these things reasonably closely. I'd never heard of her. I don't believe anyone much had ever heard, which doesn't mean that she's wouldn't be perfectly good, but it would mean you'd sort of want to go look at her opinions, wouldn't you? You'd want to see what her background was. And people are just weighing in because they should be good to have someone from Florida because Florida's a swing state, or it wouldn't be good to have someone from Florida because she doesn't seem to have any written record on, or someone like her, because she doesn't have a written record on abortion, and Amy Coney Barrett sort of does. So, that's not a very sound way to make these kinds of decisions. Because the debate itself has become very stupid on a lot of these things, I've got to say.
Well, it is distressing that the qualification seems to be, is she geographically desirable?
Right.
Instead of, as you said, we used to select people because they were leaders in the field of law. They were thought leaders. They would bring something to bear in evaluating. And when we get away from that and start looking at it as a political calculus, it's really bad. So, but let's go into sort of a lightning round of questions about the court, because it is taking front and center attention. And so we want to look at, what is it that we should be looking for? And, but let's start with, was it even appropriate? It wasn't even 2 hours after Justice Ginsburg had passed that McConnell released a statement saying that his nominee, Trump's nominee, would get a hearing and would get a vote. And that was in the face of what he did to the Obama nominee, Merrick Garland. And so the question is there any difference that would justify that? Is the hypocrisy that is clearly visible, is that going to have an impact in the selection process or even in the election?
I don't know. I think the hypocrisy could hurt Republican senators who were on tape saying in 2016, we shouldn't do this in an election year. We should let the voters speak. And now they have to invent a fake rationale of, well, then different party controlled the Senate and so forth. So it could hurt. I agree. The unseemliness struck me, and you think I'd be used to it now after 4 years of Trump, and after the last 20, 30 years of American politics, I suppose, we've been gradually going down this path. But I said to someone, so it was Rosh Hashanah evening, actually Friday night, we had the family over. And then they're little kids, so they left early, like at 7:30. And it was right around then that the news broke about Justice Ginsburg. And I remember, so someone called, pretty quickly. They were, my friends tend to be interested in all this stuff. And I remember saying, I don't know what's going to happen. But look, we obviously have 24 hours or something to think about it, because obviously no one can say anything. It'd be inappropriate except for just routine statements of, of condolence and of appreciation for her career, be inappropriate for either McConnell or Schumer, either. I mean, to say anything much. And if right tonight, that would really be terrible. And of course, I was totally wrong, And by 9 o'clock, literally, it was like 9:15, right, that McConnell puts out his statement. And by the next morning, we're in the midst of this brouhaha.
So, okay, the second question about that is, how should Democrats react? How should they respond to this rush to judgment, to the rush to appoint and confirm? Should they, even though they argued against this, you can't stop it for a year. The president's the president until inauguration, and he has to be able to do whatever the president has to do. Should they retract from that and say, you made this rule, you have to live by it, you can't act on it? Should they say, if you do, we're going to enlarge the court? Should they say, we're going to, back off of that if you'll back off of that? Should they put term limits on the court? And would that even be constitutionally permissible? What should they be doing? What should their response be to answer this?
I mean, I'm not sure. I think they should, in the short term, simply call out the Republican hypocrisy. I don't think it's quite fair to say the Democrats are being hypocritical. Not that you were saying this, but others have said this, because they said the president should be able to go ahead with his, that we should consider the president's nominee. But of course, the Republican Senate didn't. So then they're entitled to say, okay, well, you didn't, and therefore we shouldn't this time. I think the Democrats are entitled to say that, and will say that. And then I think they should pummel, frankly, the Republican senators who have been hypocrites and see if they can't win some of those seats. They should make their case in terms of the hearings about the actual nominee and continue to make that case. I think it would be unwise to sort of commit right now to what the right remedies are. Besides, I don't think I know, for one thing. I think they could say generally that they're not going to let this, they could wait. They could say that, look, we want to see, of course, if there is a justice, which they don't want, but if there is one, we'll see what the decisions are. Or they could even start exploring after the election different remedies of the kind you suggested. I think it would be unwise to but I think they should, for now, still try to make the case and appeal to the better angels of Republicans' nature that they shouldn't go ahead with this. They probably will, but they might get lucky, and as I say, things might go a little bit askew for the nomination, in which case they might still be able to deter some Republicans from going ahead.
Is there a conservative justice that you would be proud to have on the court? Is there someone either particular or in sort of generic terms who you would feel comfortable if they went ahead with?
I used to know those people, but I'm the generation I knew, of course, are now too old to be nominated for the court, especially because we do have this slightly crazy situation. Where it's such a high stakes thing that no one wants to, quote, waste a pick on someone who's, our age or something like that, which I think is bad. I mean, I would be for, if you asked me, we're having a constitutional convention, how should we set up the Supreme Court? I would be very open to either term limits and or age limits. I mean, I do think it would be healthier for the country if this were a once every 15-year thing instead of you could be making a decision for 35 years and so much therefore weighs on it. But that's not the way it is, and that would take a while to bring about. So there's no one I think is perfect or terrific. It's to say the ones that I know best are more like my age and probably wouldn't be considered good candidates. Now, the truth is, if you put J. Harvey Wilkinson from Virginia or something on the court, very thoughtful, moderate conservative, who I think is probably 65 or 70 maybe, he probably only served 10 years. So that would not fulfill the ambition of reshaping the court for a generation and a half. But he would be a thoughtful jurist. I mean, somewhat like Roberts, I would say.
Definitely not appointing someone like Senator Ted Cruz or Tom Cotton, I think, was on his list as well. Yeah. That was a bit bizarre.
That was just to make them feel good, I think.
Yeah. In this debate, Mitch McConnell has had this really influential role of bringing this, on the floor for a vote. I'm assuming that you've had many interactions with Mitch McConnell, and I'm curious as to what he's like based off of what you know about him and your interactions with him. Like, what motivates him? Is it like power? Is it just maintaining power in the Senate? Like, explain that for our audience.
Yeah, and maybe I should go after this. And that's such a hard question. I don't know that I have a good answer. I've known him, casually over the years. Mm-hmm. I would have said two things drive him. one, he very much wants to be majority leader, not minority leader, and he has been majority leader for a few years, and that's what he always aspired to. And I think, I mean, to be fair, he presumably believes that it's good to have a majority so you could pass some legislation that is in accord with your general worldview. But he's so political, such a political animal, that he sort of focuses more, I think, on the majority side of it than the legislation side of it. But that's not unheard of for legislative leaders. They like power, they want to be in the majority. Now, he has always cared a lot about the courts. And at one point, I think 25 years ago, that was connected to a certain view, may have been right, may have been wrong, but it wasn't an unrespectable view of the First Amendment and of limits on speech. And he was very much against limits on political speech. And he liked the court decisions that struck down limits on people spending money on their own behalf and then on others' behalf, at least indirectly through the independent expenditures and super PACs. I don't know that that's worked out quite as well, but I do think, to be fair to him, that's not just because Republicans might have benefited more from those decisions, and I'm not sure they really did. There are plenty of, wealthy Democrats who can spend money on super PACs too. But it was, I think, a genuine kind of sincere thought that government shouldn't regulate people's ability to run for office or to spend money on other people on behalf of other people running for office. So that would be one thing that I would have said was sort of he really cared about. I wouldn't say on the social issues that he's ever had any great interest, to my knowledge, in them, and never been a leader on them. And economics, I think he has a standard Republican view of things. Foreign policy, again, not very distinctive. So a very political guy, kind of cold-blooded, not the warmest person in the Senate. Obviously a shrewd, tough political operative. But I really wonder in this case whether the toughness and shrewdness, maybe it gets him what he wants in the short term, which he will think is the long term, which is getting a justice on the court. But I think it could really damage Republican chances to hold the Senate, to win it back even in 2 years. Not going to help Trump. Probably he's going to lose anyway. I mean, McConnell's really made, he did not like Trump. I'm sure he would have preferred a much more conventional Republican. But he for me is the most culpable of all the enablers of Trump. If McConnell had signaled early, look, it's legitimate to break with him sometimes. I mean, this is America. We're very used to people in Congress differing from their president of their own party, including the leaders in Congress sometimes. It's not like this never happens in either party, right? And we'll work it out, negotiate. Sometimes we'll negotiate with the Democrats, sometimes we'll negotiate with the Trump administration. If that had been the attitude, and we'll call out Trump when he does something that's really beyond the pale, we would have had a very different last 3.5 years. I really think, and other people could have spoken up too. I mean, it's not like these people are pathetic, are appointed by Mitch McConnell. They're elected by the voters of their state. So I don't give them a pass either, whether it's Lamar Alexander or a million others, or the other senators or members of Congress. But McConnell was in a unique position to be a check on Trump, and he really hasn't been. And I'd say even the opposite. By not stopping Trump in all kinds of ways, and by sort of excusing him or undercutting attempts to rein him in, he's done a lot of damage to the rule of law and to the constitutional system, and enabled Trump to do a lot of the damage that Trump has done.
Yeah. It sounds like you're really leaning toward the motivating, driving force for McConnell right now is the legacy of a conservative Supreme Court. But others have said his real driving motivation is to keep control of the Senate, which might change the dynamics of whether he pushes for a vote before November 3rd or in the lame duck session. How much weight do you think the people arguing that have?
And I should go after this. I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think those two are in tension with one another now. I think he's decided to go for the bird in the hand, which is getting a justice confirmed, because he, probably doesn't know what the election outcomes could be. But if his members decide it's just killing them in the election, you could have a reversal. I think the lame duck has always been very problematic. I mean, maybe, are you really, you're going to lose the election, Biden's going to win, maybe you lose the Senate, control of the Senate, and then you're just in a lame duck going to jam this through. I do think at that point, the Mitt Romneys of the world, I mean, Romney can tell himself that he's doing something sort of in accord with the law here, and somewhat in accord even with custom of just let president makes a nomination, we deal with it. We don't worry whether it's October or March. I think after 2016, that's a little bit of fanciful thing, but you can sort of see how someone could say that. To say after in a lame duck session that you're going to do that really it's never happened in American history. And so I really think it would be, I'm doubtful that could work. So I think McConnell has to jam it through now or it doesn't happen.
Yeah. I mean, as we head into election day, I mean, the biggest question for voters is just, what's the possibility of electing a Supreme Court nominee before November 3rd when voting ends, or no, after November results are confirmed, but before the Congress is sworn in on January 3rd? Like, what is the possibility of this Supreme
So
Court
yeah,
justice?
I should go here because I see but yeah, I think a lame duck confirmation is unlikely unless Trump wins, and then they might as well go ahead and do it. I mean, there's no difference, and the Republicans hold the Senate. But I think if Biden wins, it will be very hard to justify to the American people that you're confirming a Trump nominee. And I think there would be a huge public outcry, really huge, more than even what's going to happen in October, which is questionable to say the least, but not quite as like doing it in a lame duck. Anyway, I should go, but thank you so much for having me on this. This has been a fun conversation.
Thank you
so much.
Educated our viewers. We appreciate it.
I hope so. Well, thank you. Be well.
Thank you. We hope you listening also enjoyed this episode. Be sure to follow us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, and send us suggestions, ideas for future topics, and speakers you would like to see via Jill, myself, or our website. Lastly, Intergenerational Politics is now on Apple Podcasts, so be sure to subscribe and rate our channel to support us. Thanks for listening, and see you on our next episode.